what we found was that Cambridge Analytica is owned by a company called SCL, which is a worldwide global interruption, I guess you could call it, agency. And you can trace that company back to a London Israeli man, I forget his name right now. There's a good Guardian piece about this, who has for a very long time been basically creating fronts for Dmitry Firtash, who was Paul Manafort's funder in Ukraine and was working with the Russian mafia in Ukraine, particularly Semyon Mogilevich. So while I don't know that that organization, for example, that it's run by the Russian mob, it certainly is part of that same network. It is partly within that same group, and I think that we have to nail down and figure out what is going on and how that relates. The investigations, it seems, are starting to look at the Russian connections for Cambridge Analytica. Also, Michael Flynn had a stake in there, was employed by it. Steve Bannon had a stake in it. Yeah, and the Mercers. And I think that the role of a lot of those people we're still unwinding some of it, but there's definitely a relation there. There was a server in Trump Tower that was communicating with a Russian bank, Alpha Bank, throughout the election cycle. It was being pinged back and forth. Then a group of internet scientists see this, and they bring it to some journalists. Those journalists go to Alpha Bank, and they ask them about it. And then 2 hours later, the server is turned off in Trump Tower. They then asked the Trump people what's going on with that server, and they said, oh, that server hasn't been operational. First they say it doesn't exist. Then they say it hasn't been operational since 2010. Then when they show them the data, they say, oh, that was spam. But there was not a single of those communications was marked as spam when it arrived. They were only sent, respectively, during Russian or Moscow and New York business hours. And so what we have heard is that was probably not a lot of information was sent along those lines. It was probably a sort of, hey, we need to talk signal, more than it was that being the exchange of information. But it seems to be part of the information exchange, the data exchange that was happening between the Russians and the Trump campaign. I think Assange was not ideologically aligned with Putin, but I think it was a coercion and a little bit of ego. I think he was in a bad situation. I think the Americans were after him. I think he blamed Hillary Clinton for that, and this became a port in the storm. And so, he had a TV show on RT. He certainly has been supporting Russian talking points since the beginning. And my guess is that was his lifeline. I mean, he helped Snowden, according to him, get into Russia. So there certainly is a relationship there, and he, releases everything they want him to. And surprisingly, nothing since about 2010 that he's released has given the Russians any headache at all. And so I think that became a marriage of necessity and convenience for him. At least he saw it that way, is my guess. Yeah, I mean, that was certainly what first triggered us in terms of being like, this is not normal, this is not okay. But it's also not okay, not in the sense of like, oh, well, any position that they would have is bad because they're Russian. Like, I love Russia. I think Russian history is fascinating. I love Russian literature. Russian movies, Russian movies are very important. But when you have talking points that don't have consistency other than they favor the Russian state and would actually hurt America's allegiances overseas with its domestic partners, it becomes a problem of, okay, well, that would just be, hurting ourselves I don't see the upside to helping Putin in this one. And so, yeah, that was very concerning and incredibly unusual. Well, the change seems to have been done by J.D. Gordon. His reason that he gives, who's a senior advisor of the Trump campaign, the reason he gives makes very little sense, which he claims that he did it because months earlier, Trump had vaguely suggested that this might fall in line with his thinking, and he therefore, without any further instruction, made the change to the platform. That might have been slightly believable had there been any other changes that they had made to the platform at all. But because there weren't, that's completely unbelievable. And the person in the film who talks about this is John McCain, and he goes further than I think he goes anywhere else in terms of his criticisms and suspicions of the Trump campaign, that this, in fact, was core to the scandal that happened in 2016. Well, as far as we can tell, it took it really seriously. I mean, Christopher Steele was the guy on Russia. And I think that's an important thing to remember. The biggest sort of Russian case that the FBI had, or largely Russian case, was the FIFA scandal. It was a massive scandal. It was one of the largest FBI operations the last few years. And most of the information that they got that was usable came from Christopher Steele. He was Alexander Litvinenko's handler in MI6. He was a man who basically came to the West to testify against Putin and say that he was lined up with the Semyon Mogilevich and the Russian mob, and they killed him with a polonium, which was basically gave him radiation poisoning. And so Christopher Steele, if you were trying to find somebody who knew the most about Russian intelligence on the face of the earth, it was probably him, who had the best contacts. And so he had a history of making cases. And the FBI used him. I mean, one of our contacts in the film had received over 100 reports from Steele, all of which he found could be completely accurate. Now, it's an intelligence report, so even Christopher Steele wouldn't say it's 100%, everything is in it, it's definite. But he would say 70 to 90%, and I think he's probably right. And so I think that really, I mean, that was one of the things that I know that scared McCain. It's one of the things that scared a lot of people because of how accurate Steele had been and how good his reputation was.